I was sitting at the kitchen table, enjoying a bowl of muesli, when I was startled by a sharp knock on the door. Wondering who could be knocking at 8 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday, I crossed the tiled floor and opened the door. On my porch stood a man in his 40s, wearing a cheap, crumpled suit. Behind him were 3 policemen in uniform. This was definitely not your typical Sunday routine. "Mr. Young," the man in the suit asked, gesturing with his badge. "Do you mind if we come in and ask you a few questions?" "I'm afraid I can only talk to one person at a time, Detective. What was your name again?"
I replied. Cook. Detektive Richard Cook.
"I'll be asking the questions, Mr. Young. These gentlemen would like to search your home, if you don't mind," the detective added.
Do you have a warrant?
"I've seen enough cop shows to know you need a warrant to barge into my house to search, as you put it," I asserted.
No, sir, we don't have a warrant.
"I'm asking for your permission to allow these officers to search your home. You have the right to refuse my request." "Then I'll have to get a warrant," Detective Cook agreed. I couldn't really recall what I might have to hide, but then again, I didn't know what they were looking for.
You're not from Interpol, are you? I quickly asked.
"No, Mr. Young, believe me, we're not interested in illegally copied movies." "Everyone always worries about that," the detective admitted, shaking his head slowly. "Could you then tell me what this is about?" I politely inquired. "It's rather unusual for this area."
WHY do you want to search my home?
"Sir, there's been an incident, and I'm investigating it. These officers are assisting me."
Is there any reason you'd like to refuse my request, Detective Cook?
"Well, yes, because I can, because I don't want a bunch of strangers roaming around my house, because the floors are clean, and I want them to stay that way. Otherwise, my wife will give me hell when she wakes up," I replied.
Reason enough.
"How about I drag you down to the station and conduct a 5 or 6 hour interrogation while my colleagues obtain a warrant to search your clean house with a fine-tooth comb?"
Cook growled.
"Gentlemen, you may enter and search while I entertain Detective Cook," I said, addressing the 3 officers in uniform. I wasn't sure why the cops were so eager to search my home, but I was almost certain they wouldn't find anything dreadful, except perhaps those tags the kids ripped off their mattresses and snuck past the cashier 15 years ago. If tensions escalated, Cook could haul off to Pennsylvania University and arrest both of my sons. I learned the hard way not to warn them about the illegality of removing those tags. I gestured to a chair for Cook as the 3 men in uniform entered the kitchen. I noticed they slowed their pace and stopped at the island in the center of the room. They turned almost simultaneously to look in my direction. "Only one at a time," I grumbled as this holy trinity dove into my box of fresh donuts. I had bought a dozen jelly-filled donuts just minutes before their arrival, and their aroma had triggered their professional instincts. At that moment, my wife, June, cautiously entered the kitchen, tightly clutching the collar of her robe to her throat.
Steve, what's going on?
"Why are the police walking around our house eating donuts? Is something wrong?" she asked, visibly concerned.
June, this is Detective Cook.
I hope he'll enlighten us about the situation by asking his questions. I've allowed them to look around, as Cook mysteriously put it.
Detective, this is my wife, June.
Perhaps you could tell us why you're here investigating an incident. Mr. Robert Morgan was eliminated last night around midnight. I suppose you both knew him well.
Yes, he was June's boss.
You shouldn't be short of suspects. Cook, this guy churned out buckled at husbands faster than rabbits. You should be looking for a jealous husband or maybe even a whole platoon, I smirked, feeling no sorrow for my wife's late employer.
No one else even cracked a smile.
June's face turned paler than I had ever seen, and tears welled up in her eyes. Cook merely nodded slightly, studying my face. Aside from June's quiet sobs, the room fell into a tomb-like silence. "Mrs. Young, how long have you been having an affair with your employer, Robert Morgan?" the detective asked. "I didn't have an affair with him, not really," June sobbed. "It was more of a chance encounter. I didn't love him or anything like that. We first met maybe about 6 months ago. I would never hurt anyone, especially not Bob." "I never assumed that, Mrs. Young. I'm just trying to gather all the facts," Cook dryly stated. "How did your husband react to your relationship with Mr. Morgan? Was he jealous, angry, upset when he found out?" "Steve had no idea I was seeing anyone until this moment, Mr. Cook. This topic, of course, was never discussed between us. I'm sure Steve would be upset, but it wasn't enough to hurt Bob," June replied, though with less conviction than I would have liked from my wife. "Really?" grumbled the detective. "Mr. Young, how would you answer the same questions?" "They started seeing each other on August 9th of this year," I calmly replied. It was after a dinner party at the Morgans. I was called away early due to work issues. He offered to drive June home and ended up sleeping with her in the back seat of his SUV. I'm not upset because June and I have an understanding. Simply put, we can sleep with whoever we want, and we do. June chose Morgan. It was strictly between them. June's jaw dropped almost to the floor at my revelation. It took her a few seconds to process all the information I just dumped on the detective. I could see the wheels turning very slowly in her head. Why have I never heard of this so-called agreement? June asked indignantly. Because that's what unspoken means, dear, I quickly retorted. If we discussed it, I'd say we had an oral agreement, and if we signed it and notarized it, it would be a written agreement.
Auers was unspoken.
Well, it would have been nice to know about it, June said. I've tried so hard to keep you from finding out about Bob. I think from now on all our agreements should be laid out verbally or even documented. This wandering is getting on my nerves. That answer doesn't seem exhaustive to me, admitted Cook, reaching into his shirt pocket and pulling out a small recorder. You both should know that I'm recording everything you say. Mrs. Young, have you been involved with any other gentleman, or was Mr. Morgan your only lover? Of course, he was the only one, protested June, perhaps overly emphatically.
I'm a married woman.
How can you even ask me such questions? As far as you know, did your husband take advantage of this unspoken agreement, or was he completely faithful to you?
Cook asked.
Steve will never break our wedding vows, Detective, June responded somewhat indignantly. He's faithful as an old dog, you can write that down. Mr. Young, I'm asking you the same questions again. Do you agree with your wife's answers? June has been sleeping with her colleague Bill Anderson since September 15th. Aside from affairs with these two aforementioned men, she's as faithful to me as the guys are proudly bearing that name in one of our national parks, I answered emotionlessly, while June let out a barely audible sigh. You seem remarkably well informed, Mr. Young, and even more remarkable is your lack of emotion, noted the detective. Many men would be angered and contemplate revenge upon learning that their wife entertains two lovers. Why do you take this all so calmly, Mr. Young? As I've said, we have an understanding. June was rather blatant about it, but I exercised more discretion, if you catch my drift, I replied with a shy smirk. It seemed June was about to snap. Her eyes stopped shedding tears, they just bulged out of their sockets. Her face was now more bright crimson than white, and with her left hand, she crushed a jelly-filled donut. The jelly oozed through her fingers and dripped all over her robe, though she seemed not to notice. In other words, you're saying you had a lover or two? Demanded the astonished detective. And it appears your wife didn't know? Who is your affair with, and when did it start, Mr. Young? You're quite perceptive. No wonder you became a detective, not even reaching 50, I retorted sarcastically. I first engaged in intimacy with Janet Morgan on August 11th, 2 days after her husband was with June in the back seat of his car. Since then, we've managed to do it practically every weekday, I reminisced fondly. In shock, June raised her hand to her temple, causing the jelly in her hand to settle on her forehead. She seemed not to notice, and Cook was too polite to draw attention to it, especially as he struggled to form a coherent sentence.
Good Lord, he exclaimed.
You were with Janet Morgan every weekday? I briefly questioned her last night, and she didn't mention your name once. Is there a chance you're mistaken, or attempting a jest? Do you want to hear her mention my name, Cook? Hide in her bedroom closet the next time I visit her, and you'll hear her call me by name.
Of course, I'm not mistaken.
I distinctly remember the names of all the women, I declared firmly. Do you have more than one lover? Now that you ask, I must confess I've been doing the horizontal mambo with Lisa Anderson since mid-September. We dance several times every weekend and sometimes even during the week. The jelly now freely streamed down June's face as she slumped into a chair in a near catatonic state. Cook swallowed some small tablet. After a moment to compose himself, Cook leaned forward. Mr. Young, you must understand, you have affairs with the wives of two men who are sleeping with your wife. Can I assume this is no coincidence? I might even venture to say I've seen Mrs. Anderson, and she's quite attractive. I won't tell you what you can or cannot assume, Cook, but I took these two women right after their husbands took June.
Revenge.
Sleeping with the wives of your wife's lovers, sweet revenge is even sweeter, and I've been fortunate enough to savor that incredible high, I replied with evident pleasure. You mean to tell me you killed Robert Morgan to avenge his affair with your wife, but you were sleeping with his wife every weekday? Isn't that enough for you?
Cook demanded.
The answer to both of your questions is a categorical no.
In due time, you will understand my ultimate vengeance, I promise it.
What questions did you just answer no to? The puzzled detective asked, fiddling with his dictaphone to replay his previous questions. So, are you saying you didn't kill Robert Morgan, or are you saying he wasn't killed out of vengeance? Cook asked, listening to his own questions. I can't answer yes to both of those questions, I replied.
Damn it, cursed Cook.
I must remember to ask one question at a time. At that moment, one of the officers in uniform brought a large handgun into the kitchen and waved it in front of Detective Cook's skeptical eyes. I found this in the gun safe in the basement, the officer beamed. Do you want to mark it as evidence and take it? Great idea, exclaimed Cook. Make sure to dust it for fingerprints in the lab. The owner of those prints is either the criminal or the dumbest person alive. The officer blushed slightly as he left the room holding my .44 Magnum in one hand and my donuts in the other. Things are starting to leak out nicely, chuckled the detective, watching a strawberry filling drip from June's nose onto the kitchen table near the donut box.
No pun intended.
Morgan was taken out with a .44 Magnum. Do you own such a gun, Mr. Young?
Von Neid I SAVA. 44 Magnum et Bill Andersons.
It got me thinking. As you know, jealous husbands can be awful people. I realized I needed a gun as good as Bill's in case he came after me in a rage. Not all men are as understanding as I am, so I went and bought one just like it, I explained. We have motive and weapon, smiled Cook. Now all we need is opportunity. I assume you spent a quiet evening at home with your wife. Actually, I spent most of the evening at Lisa Anderson's house, and to be precise, in her marital bed. I left exactly at 11:12 and came straight home. June was asleep when I got here. I'm not sure if Lisa can recall the time, as she was quite drunk when I left, I added.
That's convenient, isn't it?
You remember the exact time you left, but Mrs. Anderson was too scatterbrained to remember anything, and your wife was asleep when you returned home. I'm almost afraid to ask, but how did you recall the exact time you left the Anderson residence?
Cook inquired.
Her husband left a message on the answering machine. He said he was driving from the airport home.
It was 10:12.
I knew the best he could do for coming home was an hour, so I aimed to leave before 11:12. I spotted his car driving through their neighborhood as I headed home, I said. Even if you left at 11:12, as you claim, you had enough time to get to Morgan's house and take him out when he opened the door. I believe we have enough evidence to arrest you, Mr. Young, the detective concluded, very pleased. He was about to reach for the handcuffs when his cell phone rang. Cook gestured for one of his boys to watch me as he stepped outside to take the call, maintaining confidentiality. He was gone for nearly 10 minutes. The expression on his face when he returned told me everything.
Detektive Burns just got a full confession from Bill Anderson.
He claims he came home from the airport and found his wife drunk. He exploded when he noticed Robert Morgan's wallet on the floor next to his wife. He brought it over to Morgan's. At first, he tried to deny it, but he cracked under Burns' interrogation. Do you have any idea how Robert Morgan's wallet ended up on the floor of Anderson's bedroom?
Cook asked.
I have no clue, Cook, I replied quietly. He often left it on the nightstand beside his bed. I've noticed it a few times. Why he or anyone else left it in the Andersons' house by mistake is a complete mystery to me. It seems one of your wife's lovers is going away for a very long time, and it's putting the second lover of hers behind bars. All this time you've been sleeping with their wives far more frequently than they were with yours, even if there were two of them. Now your wife is sitting here in some kind of trance, burying her head in a box of jelly donuts. That's sweeter, was my only reply.